Hello everyone, welcome once again to this tutorial. So in this tutorial we are going to learn about React Context API. If you are watching this video, I assume you have a basic knowledge in JavaScript and React. It is however not required to know them before you actually watch the video. We're going to look at what is Context API in React. So I've opened the React docs here. So when you open the context API section and the advanced guides, the definition you would see for context is context provides a way to pass data through the component tree without having to pass props down manually at every level. Yeah, and this is basically it. Because if you've used React before, or if you have some level of experience with React, you would actually know that passing data via the props becomes very complex when the props are going to be used by many components within the project, and with that you have to manually or explicitly pass the props down the component tree. And then sometimes you'd notice that some components would have to receive the props only to pass it down to its children. The component itself is not actually going to use the props, and this is known as prop drilling. This kind of situation is what Context API looks to solve. Basically, when we talk about Context API in React, it is actually designed to share a global data that can be used in any part of our application without passing props down the component tree. Let's actually see how we are going to use Context API to build a very simple user list application. So I'm using Create React app to bootstrap my application. If you want to follow along, just do npx create react app and then give your project a name in your command line. I've already done that and this is my project. So when I open the SRC folder, it's just the default files that React gives us when you bootstrap your project with Create React app. We are basically going to create component folder here because I'm going to use some components, rename it to components with S. And then when we open the app.js file, you'd see that we have the default setup. Going to remove everything here, put hello world here for now, save it, and then also get rid of the logo. We are not going to use any CSS, but we would leave this here for now. We are not going to focus on styling, we are only going to focus on functionality and implementation. I'll get rid of some of the files that I don't need. I would save this one. Let's run the application and see if it is going to start. npm run start. It is starting up now. We see our hello world here, which means that everything is working fine. So the first component that I'm going to create is called add user. I'm also going to create another component which is going to be called user.js. You would know very soon what I'm going to use those components for. And then I'm also going to create user list.js file. I'm using this snippet to generate the component. This is going to be the user list component. I'm going to do RAFCE to generate. This is the user component RAFCE. I'm going to say add user component here just to see that those components are showing up. Let's come here and then actually use those components here and see if all of them are showing up. So it is going to be add user lists, and I'm going to have the user component here. So let me save it, go and see that here all of them are showing up here. The last file I'm going to create inside the SRC is called context.js file, and that's where I'm going to create my context. So how do we create a context? So first I would have to import something we call create context. I'm going to import it from React, And then because it's in a separate file, I'm going to actually export the instance that I'm going to create. So I'm going to export constant. I'm going to call it app context, which is going to be equal to the create context method. You can initialize it to null or something like that, where I'll leave it empty. This create context method is going to help us create a context instance, which will actually help us send data to the various components. Alright, so this is how we actually create a context instance for our application. So first you import the context, and then you set a variable to the create context method. And I'm exporting it so that I'll be able to actually use it in other components. So I'm going to close this one up because its job is done. I'm going to come here, that is app.js file. I'm going to use a state to keep track of my users. I'm going to use the use state hook from React to keep track of my users. This is going to be the method to modify the states, and I'm going to use states, and I would have to import use states from React. So let me just click on it so that it imports for me. Now I'm going to create one user up here. The user is going to have an ID 1. I would have a name, John, age 26, and then I'm going to have a bio for the user, which I'm going to write something here: full-time software engineer at Victoria. Yeah, I'm going to initialize my state with this one user so that we would see something on the screen. So the next thing I'm going to do is to provide my context to my application. And how we do that is inside here. I'll just remove this hello world. I'm going to use the app context that I created and do dots provide and wrap it around my components. So cut it and bring it here. But I would have to import this. It's called app context from context. Now I can use it here and then do the provide. One thing that I have to do is to do the value. What is the value going to be equal to? When I am using the value attribute here on the app context of provider, I am actually sending the data to like these components that I'm wrapping the app context in. So I am making the data, which in this case I'm going to pass the users here. I'm making the users available to these components. So whichever component that I'm going to need the users in, I can use it in that component. So there's no need for me to pass props so that probably their children components can inherit. Because I am wrapping the app context to provide and passing the value, I'm making the users data actually available to these components. The first value that I'm going to make it available to the component is the users, and then I'm going to create a function here. I'll call it dispatch user event. So this is actually going to modify the states based on the user event that is going to come from any of our components. So it is going to receive something we call an action type, and then what we call the payload. So this action type is actually going to tell us which action we are performing on the user list. Right? And the action types that I'm going to have is add user and remove user, which I'm going to use switch case to actually handle it. So I'm going to switch the action type, and the first case is going to be a type of add user. So when it sees this kind of action, what is it supposed to do? So I'm going to use the set users, right? So I'm adding a new user to the state. So I'm going to spread everything in users. I'm going to add the new user that is coming from the payload. So payload dot new user. This basically means that when I send an action type of add user, get this new user object from the payload, and then probably modify the state by adding it to the list of users we have. Let me first set up the default and just say return. And then here too, I would have to do return so that it does not move to the next one. And then the next case is going to be remove user. It's also going to call the set users. And what I'm going to do is to do a filter on the users. So I want to filter and then remove the user where the ID coming from the payload matches with any of the users ID here. So payload dot user ID, and I'm going to do return here. Add user is going to add a new user to the list of users. Remove user is going to filter and remove the user whose ID matches the ID we are sending from the payload. This is done. I'm going to make the dispatch user event also available by passing it here, so that any of the components in here can dispatch a user event to the state. And then one thing I'm going to do before is that I'm going to remove this user component because it's actually going to be used in the user list component, right? So the only component we need here is the user list add user component. Let's see how we can actually display users onto the screen. In our user list component, what we are going to do is we are going to use the context that we've created. Since we are using functional components, React actually makes a hook available for us to actually get the data coming from the context we've created. The hook is called use context, and we are going to import it from React. So use context. So we are going to the structure and use the users data, use context, and we have to tell it the context we are using, which is app context. We are using the app context that we provided to our component here. So if you want to use the context, this is how you use it. So this is called users, not user. So if you want to also make use of the dispatch user event which we pass here, we can also use that here. But in this particular component, we are only going to use the users because this component is actually going to display the list of users. Okay, so here I'm going to create an h3, and then I'm going to call it available users. What I'm going to do is I'm going to map through the users that we have. So I'm doing users.map, and then I'm getting the user, I'm getting each user, and then I'm going to use my user component to display each user. And I have to import it up here. Because I'm doing a map, I'm looping through, I have to give it a key. It is required by React. So unique key, which is going to be the user ID, and then I am also going to provide the user information here. Okay, so now I have the user information for this user component. So I would save this and then go here, and then now I have access to a user. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to display the information here. So first I'll display the username in h3 user.name. I would have h4 for the age, user.age, and then for the div, just use a small tag to display the user.bio. So when I save it and go here, element is invalid, expected a string for built-in component or class, I got undefined. So let's see what is wrong here. Yeah, actually, sorry. I think I made a typo here. Instead of provider, I made it provide. So it is app context dot provider, not provide, right? Yeah, sorry about that. So I would save it, go here, and then my user is showing here. We have the name, the age, and then the bio here. Let's close the user component. And now let's see how we can actually add a new user to the list. Now before I do that, I just want to do a very little styling here. I'll do an inline styling. So what I'm going to do is to do style and then do border 1 pixel, solid gray, like that, just to give a very little border around the list of users. I'm also going to do this here. I'll just add a display called inline block, just like this, and then I'm going to add a little bit of padding, like 10 pixels. Okay, so it's looking good now. Let's see how we can add a user. Go to the add user component. I'm going to create an h3. I'm going to call it add new user. Yeah, add new user. I'm going to have an input. I'm going to have a placeholder for it. It's going to be name. I'm gonna copy the same thing for age. I'll use a text area for this particular one. Just give it a placeholder. By to get the values from the input when I type, I'm going to use a state to actually keep track of the values that will come from this input here, so that we can actually dispatch an event to the global state. I'm going to use useState, so constant. It's first going to keep track of the name, and then set name. It's going to come from useState, and then I would have to import the useState up here. useState. I'm going to do the same thing for age and bio. It's gonna be set age and then set bio, and then I'm going to give the values to these forms. First one is going to be name, second one is going to be age, and then third one is going to be bio, and then next is going to be the onChange event. So onChange is also going to actually do something, right? So I'm going to pass an arrow function here for each of these. So arrow function e, and now this is going to be set name, call set name with e dot target dot value, just like that. I'm going to do the same thing for the rest. So set age, set bio. Nice. So now my state is keeping track of the values that is coming from the input. So I'm now going to make use of the dispatch user event coming from the context, and I'm going to use the same hook, use context const. I'm going to destructure the dispatch user event, and it's going to come from use context and then app context, which I'm also going to import. Down here, I'm going to have the button to add a user. So add user. On click, handle add user method, and add user method, which I'm going to create up here. So const handle add user, which is going to do a dispatch user event. The action type is going to be add user. It accepts payload. It's actually not an object. Payload is actually going to be the user, the new user that we've created. So I'm going to get the user information here, user, which is going to be an object containing the ID, and with the ID I'm just going to generate a random ID using math.random, and I'm going to pass the name, the age, and then the bio here, new user, set to the user information here. Let's see if the dispatch user event is going to work. So when we go back here, we should see our form with this add user. But let me actually make the form be on a new line by adding a PR tag, just like this. BR, yep, just remove this, and then another one here. Yeah, and that should actually make our inputs go on. So we add a new user. What's going to be the name? Justina. Age is 27. Bio is graphic designer. Add, and there we go. We have our new user added to the list of users. Right. So let's add another one. This one is called Eric. He's 32 years, and he is a software developer at M and M. And there we go. So our dispatch user event is working correctly, and you would notice that it's coming from the context that we actually created. The last thing that we're going to do is to see if we can dispatch an event to remove a user. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go into my user component. I'm going to add a button down here, delete user, and it's going to have an on click as well, which is going to be handle remove user. I'm going to paste this up here. I'm going to change the function name to this and import my context as well. Sorry, import it, import the app context, and then I'm going to remove this. And with this particular one, I would have to get the ID from the user, right, as a payload. So I'm gonna pass the user to remove, which is going to come from user.id. Action type is remove user. Save it. That's what we have here. So we should see buttons on the users list of users. Remove. So let me try and remove Eric. So let's go and check what is actually wrong. Remove user event. We are doing a filter and we are using the user ID equal to this. Yes, actually this is what is wrong. So we are filtering the ID which actually matches the one that is coming. So we actually want to remove that one instead. So we actually do the not here to remove that particular user and leave the rest. Now that should be working. So let's add John, senior software engineer at Vitawa. Let's add it back, and then let's add Justina back also. So I was 27. She was a graphic designer. So we add Justina back, and let's try to remove Eric. Eric is gone. John is gone, and Justina is gone. Add it back. John again. Add it back. Add more users. Remove. Perfect. Context is very useful, and yeah, basically this is how you actually use it. So we are going to end the video here. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to leave a comment in the comment section. Like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't like it. But for now, see you next time.